This is the United States History 201, Presentation 16, The Age of Jackson, Part 1. So we're going to look at U.S. history from 1824 to 1841 in this first presentation for new material for Unit 4. And we'll cover the second part of this, The Age of Jackson, 41 to 50, in Presentation 17. So let's go ahead and get started. So essentially what we're doing here is picking up where we left off in Presentation 15 with the end of the Monroe administration. And the 1824 election really is a changing of the guard, so to speak. There are no members of the founding generation considered for office. Andrew Jackson is nominally considered part of the founding generation, but he was just a teenager, 13 years old or so, when the American War for Independence was ending. So he wasn't really considered part of that generation. And this is also the first year the popular vote will be tallied. And that actually leads to some problems for the elections. It's very contentious. In fact, you have 5 major candidates for election in 24. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who was the Secretary of War. During the campaign, he decided to become the vice presidential candidate on the 2 front-running tickets, which were Adams and Jackson. You have William H. Crawford of Georgia as the Secretary of the Treasury. He's going to suffer a stroke during the campaign, so he won't really be considered after that. Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was the Speaker of the House, and keep that in mind because that's going to be important moving forward. And John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who is Secretary of State, and then Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, who is a senator and war hero. You can see that the interesting thing about this, though, is that 4 of the 5 candidates are from the South. South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And only 1 candidate from the North. Now, you can see the 24 election is a mess. Jackson's going to get the plurality of the popular vote and the Electoral College. But because there's no majority winner, nobody gets the majority, this election will be thrown to the House of Representatives. And remember, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so he's going to have a major impact here on how this election plays out. Because Jackson got a plurality, he thinks, well, the election should be his, right? I mean, he got more votes than anybody else. He got more Electoral College votes than anybody else, so he should win. Not so fast. What happens is the day before the election in the House, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams have supper together, and the next day Adams is given the presidency. And so the Jackson camp immediately screams this is a corrupt bargain, and they think this because Henry Clay is offered the position of Secretary of State, and this was seen as the pathway to the executive branch, executive office, because John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State, James Monroe was Secretary of State, James Madison was Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. So obviously if you're Secretary of State, you're then going to be president. And this was why the Jackson camp screamed from the top of their lungs, well, this is I should have won, the fix is in, because Clay worked himself into a position, and he probably did. And there's no doubt about it. This probably is what happened. But regardless, John Quincy Adams is elected president, so he'll be the 6th president of the United States. He'll serve 1 term. His father was still alive when Adams was elected president, and he wrote his son a letter saying that no man who ever held the office would congratulate another on attaining it. And they both had this very pessimistic view of the executive office and what it's going to do. But what you're going to see here, though, is really the split of the American political process into 2 parties again. The Adams and Clay group will be known as the National Republicans, and the Jackson group, the Democratic Republicans. So the 2-party system begins to surface again. You'd have gone away during the Monroe administration, the so-called era of good feelings, but everyone knew that there were differences in these Republicans. Clay and Adams, they were Republicans. I mean, Clay definitely, but they were nationalists. And then on the other side, but Jackson was a nationalist too, as we're going to find out. But they weren't as interested in the Federalist economic plan, or the American system, as Henry Clay called it. So John Quincy Adams supports the American system. He supports federally funded internal improvements. He supports a national university, laws that promote industry, commerce, finance, the arts, and sciences. And he's going to use a very broad interpretation of the Constitution to do it. Of course, he faces obstruction from the Congress because many of the people in the Congress believe the fix was in, and they're going to try to block anything he wants to do. And, of course, his vice president, John C. Calhoun, is also against this type of program. But that doesn't mean some of this stuff won't get passed. In fact, in 1828, the Congress will pass the Tariff of 1828. Remember, I talked about the Tariff of 1816. Tariff legislation is going to be important. Well, here it is in 1828. It's important. In fact, the state of South Carolina called this tariff the Tariff of Abominations, because it protected northern textile and iron industries from foreign competition. Now, this is going to harm South Carolina because South Carolina imports all these things. They don't have any industry. So this is a sectional law, they say. In fact, the legislature of South Carolina passes 8 resolutions against the tariff, calling it unconstitutional, oppressive, and unjust. John C. Calhoun, in fact, will secretly write something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, where he dusts off this idea of nullification, which was, of course, first expounded upon by Jefferson and Madison, and he perhaps advocates secession as a last resort. Now, his version of nullification was a little different from Jefferson and Madison's, but he's still using it as a final check on the authority of the central government, and no one knew he wrote it at the time, at least outside of South Carolina, but Calhoun's going to become a very important figure. Now, the election of 1828 rolls around, and Jackson and Adams are going to be the only two candidates at this point. Jackson, of course, known as Old Hickory. And in this election, Jackson's going to win in a very close mudslinging contest, though. The two camps really threw a lot of dirt at each other, and some of that was true. In fact, the Adams people are going to be very hard on Jackson's wife. They claim her as being a bigamist because she was married when Jackson married her, and this is true. The Jackson camp is going to respond with some attacks against Adams, saying that he pimps for the Russian Tsar, and he's got a pool table in the White House, and those things weren't true. But the fact is that these accusations were very hard on Jackson's wife, and she actually had a heart attack and died before Jackson became president. So he never forgave those who were involved, and principally Henry Clay. Henry Clay became his arch enemy. Anything to do with Clay, Jackson hated Clay, so he was going to be against it. Jackson's vice president, though, is going to be John C. Calhoun, or the vice president during this administration is going to be John C. Calhoun. And in so many ways, Jackson's returning to Jeffersonian rhetoric, but not really action. Jackson is still a nationalist. He doesn't really care for decentralization. But the important thing about this, really, is that he is the first president from outside Virginia or Massachusetts. This is the first time that's happened. And a lot of people said, there goes the neighborhood. All these Westerners coming into D.C. and having a big party at the White House and people jumping off the balconies. But it was seen as a turning point in American history, so to speak, in this 1828 election. So here you can see it's Jackson wins. It says close. It wasn't extremely close, but it really was a dirty campaign. Now, within a year of taking office, Jackson has to deal with this issue of this tariff and the growing problem of nullification in his eyes. In fact, in 1830, two senators, Daniel Webster and Robert Hayne, are going to debate in the Senate about the idea of nullification of the tariff. Webster would criticize the South for a stand against Union. And this is interesting because just 15 years before this, Daniel Webster made a speech where he defended the idea of nullification and secession, but now he's completely against it because he said it's disunion. Whereas Hayne would defend the position under the 10th Amendment and, of course, said nullification was perfectly justifiable. So what you're seeing here is North against South, the North being the centralizing section, the South being the states' rights section, and it's just a different how they view government. And this debate had been going on for the entire time the Constitution was written to this point, but it's really coming to a head now here in 1830. Now, Andrew Jackson is going to give a toast around this time at the annual Jefferson Day dinner, where he'll make a statement, "The Union, long may it endure," and Calhoun will respond in kind, "The Union next to our liberty most dear. May we always remember that it can only be preserved by distributing equally the benefits and burdens of the Union." So what he's saying here is the Union is great, but if you don't have liberty, then what's the point? And you can only keep a Union if every section, every state is equally burdened and benefited by the Union. So this is really an open dispute with Jackson, and Jackson can't stand Calhoun for this. He also finds out eventually that Calhoun wanted him censured during the Seminole War of 1818 after his actions in Florida. So now Jackson's got another personal enemy in John C. Calhoun. And Jackson worked that way. He had personal enemies. Calhoun will later resign his position as vice president and accept a position as senator from South Carolina. But that comes a little bit later, and he would debate Webster then, and a follow-up debate after the Webster-Hayne debate. Now, before we get to all that, I have to take a second and talk about something called the Petticoat Affair. It has to do with Peggy Eaton. Peggy Eaton was the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, and the two had an affair. Peggy Eaton was married to another man, and then she divorces him and marries John Eaton, and her first husband will commit suicide. Well, the women of the cabinet, and namely Floride Calhoun, who was John C. Calhoun's wife, refused to associate with a woman of such loose morals, and so she's ostracized. Andrew Jackson will call on the cabinet when he finds out about this, and he'll tell these guys, hey, look, you either tell your wives that they're going to associate with Peggy Eaton, or you all can resign. Well, they're not going to tell her that, tell their wives that, so they all resign. The only one who sticks around is Martin Van Buren, who's a bachelor, And so Jackson really didn't care because he relied on what was called his kitchen cabinet instead. This is a group of people that meet in the kitchen of the White House, and they talk about policy. The cabinet to him was just a nuisance. These people could be hired and fired. And so that's what he's going to do, and particularly when we get to one issue. Now, in 1832, Congress will pass a new tariff. This tariff is even higher than the tariff of 1828. And South Carolinians, led by the governor Robert Hayne, who had resigned his position as senator, and Robert Barnwell Rhett, will begin arming themselves for a possible conflict with the central government. And then the state of South Carolina will call a convention, and they will pass something called the Ordinance of Nullification, where they nullify the tariff. Calhoun will come back to his home, which is now at Clemson University. He'll make a speech called the Fort Hill Address, and he'll wait it out. He sides with South Carolina, and he will eventually accept a position as senator from South Carolina. But he thinks that Jackson wants him hung for treason. So Jackson is facing an open crisis. His vice president is against him. Calhoun, as I said, later resigned and took a seat in the Senate, while South Carolina was ready to secede if the tariff was not reduced. So Jackson understands that the tariff is too high. So he goes to Congress and asks them to lower the tariff, but he also calls nullification disunion and treason, and it advocates a force bill, the authorization to use force against South Carolina if they refuse to collect the tariff. So Henry Clay of Kentucky is going to work on a compromise. The tariff will be reduced while the force bill will be passed. So this puts South Carolina in a position where if they still agitate and still advocate nullification, well, then the government can send in the army. Well, the state will then call a convention again, and once the compromise passes, South Carolina will rescind their ordinance of nullification toward the tariff, but then they then declare the force bill null and void and adjourn. So they've nullified the force bill, which they said was unconstitutional. Both sides claim victory, but this is really a victory for nullification because the tariff was reduced. South Carolina got what they wanted. Another major issue in the first Jackson administration is the Bank of the United States. So in 1816, we had another Bank of the United States charter. We talked about that in the Madison presentation. And the president of the bank was a man named Nicholas Biddle. Well, he and Henry Clay are very good friends, and Henry Clay decides to try to make the bank a major issue in the 1836 campaign. So he pushes for a recharter before it's due. He says, let's just get this out of the way now. The 1832 presidential election is coming up. If I can make this an issue, if Jackson does something, I can work with this. So when Jackson finds out that Henry Clay is behind the bank bill, he vetoes it. He vetoes it on Jeffersonian grounds, and the bank is going to die a slow death in 1836, but this results in something called the Bank War. Jackson will then ask his Secretary of the Treasury to withdraw all the U.S. deposits from the bank. This man refuses to do so, and so Jackson will fire him. Then he'll hire another one. He refuses to do so, so Jackson will fire him. He does this 4 times until he gets to Roger Taney, who eventually agrees to withdraw the U.S. deposits, which breaks the law, by the way, from the Bank of the United States, and put them in pet banks, these state banks that Jackson was loyal to. This greatly disrupts the finances of the United States for a time and actually leads to a depression. But no matter, Jackson got what he wanted, and Henry Clay, of course, opposes him in the 32 election, but Henry Clay loses in a crushing way. I mean, Clay doesn't even get close in the Electoral College. Does a little better on the popular vote, but you can see that there are some other candidates out there, the anti-Masonic party, and South Carolina has their own candidate, the independent Democrat, John Floyd of Virginia, is their presidential candidate. But you can see that Jackson's going to win a crushing majority in 32, and so he thinks this is a mandate. Yes, the people are behind me, and Clay needs to be squashed. Now, before the 32 election, though, there was another important piece of legislation, something called the Indian Removal Act, passed in Congress. Jackson signed it into law, and the idea was to encourage resettlement of the 5 civilized tribes of the Indian Territory, and that would be the 5 civilized tribes of the South, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole. But there was immediate resistance to this. As you might imagine, these people don't want to be kicked off their land, and the impetus behind this was gold in Georgia. There was gold discovered in the mountains, and the Cherokee were on that land, and they wanted to get, the state of Georgia wanted that gold. So here is a map of the eventual relocation to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. You can see the Cherokee got the biggest part of it. The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole. But here we are, Fort Mitchell's right here on the map. So Fort Mitchell's actually going to be a staging point for the Creek Indians to come out of Alabama, whether through a southern route or a northern route. But you can also see the Cherokee go, so did the Seminoles, so did the Chickasaw and the Choctaw. So this is a major process. In fact, the Cherokee are going to sue to stay on their land. Their Cherokee chief, John Ross, sues the United States in court. Sues the state of Georgia in court, and in fact, the Supreme Court will side with the Cherokee. But John Marshall made the decision, and so Andrew Jackson, when he gets word of the decision, says, well, John Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. So he's not going to enforce the decision of the Supreme Court, and so Indian removal will continue. And this leads to the Trail of Tears in 1838. This is actually under the Martin Van Buren administration, and the man who was in charge of this was Winfield Scott. We'll talk about him more later, but this is the forced relocation of the Cherokee to the Indian Territory. Other tribes, of course, as I said, went as well. But the Cherokee, in fact, were given most of the land, the most land, and a very large sum of money. But there were many deaths along the route. And Amazing Grace became the official song of the Cherokee because of these deaths. And the Cherokee were, by this point, very much westernized. They had plantations, they had slaves. They were very much like the rest of the South. You have differing interpretations as to how poorly mistreated the Cherokee were. Winfield Scott said it wasn't bad. The Cherokee, of course, said it was terrible. So it's probably somewhere in the middle. Winfield Scott was probably underestimating how bad it was. The Cherokee may have been overestimating. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But regardless, this is a tragic time for the Cherokee. They lose everything they had, and they have to relocate somewhere else. The Seminole decide they're going to fight, and so Chief Osceola will engage in something called the Second Seminole War, which takes place between 1835 and 1842. So there's heavy resistance to relocation here. And then, of course, the Creek Nation coming out of Fort Mitchell. Some of the Creek just disappeared rather than be relocated. And again, Fort Mitchell here. Now, it's also in this period of time you'll have the Black Hawk War in Michigan and Illinois. This is really the final Indian War in the Old Northwest until the 1860s. So the United States is in the process here in the 1830s clearing out native Indian tribes from these areas so white settlement can continue. Now, 1834 is an important year because it's a year that you get an opposition party, the Whigs. National Republicans and Southern Nullifiers would form an uneasy coalition, really, in their mutual disdain for Andrew Jackson, who they called King Andrew. And, of course, that name Whig comes from European antecedents. The Whigs were the opponents of the king. So by doing this, they're basically saying Andrew Jackson is King Andrew. And this term was first used in South Carolina during the nullification controversy there in that state. So, and they're against central authority. It's against centralization. That's the idea of the Whigs. Now, it doesn't work out that way ultimately, but that's what that term means. It's the connotation behind the term. Now, the election of 1836 rolls around, and the Democrats will nominate Martin Van Buren of New York for president. Van Buren basically got his due. He was a real party man. He actually organized the first modern political convention and modern political party in New York. And he does a very good job at that. And so he's going to be able to mobilize votes. The Whigs nominate sectional candidates. The idea was to get the election thrown to the House of Representatives where they could win again. And it almost works. So they just pick several people, and this is the same thing that happened in 24. They're trying to get it to happen again in 36. You can see it almost works. Van Buren gets barely a majority in the popular vote and barely a majority in the Electoral College. If Pennsylvania, for example, had gone to another candidate, then Martin Van Buren, the election would have been thrown to the House of Representatives, so it would have been a disaster. So Van Buren is the 8th President of the United States, serves one term, 1837 to 1841. Really, the important issue during the Van Buren administration are these depressions that are a result of the meddling of the financial situation with Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States. So there's two depressions, 37 and 39. And Martin Van Buren's recommendation was to establish an independent treasury and go to a hard money policy, which will eventually happen. It doesn't happen in his administration, but it will eventually happen. And the other thing, the foreign policy issue during the Van Buren administration is something called the Rootstock War of 1838. No firing, no shooting actually happened, but this is a border dispute between Canada and the United States. Which brings us to the election of 1840. The Whigs will finally select one candidate, William Henry Harrison, the war hero. The Democrats will nominate Van Buren, and this is often called the log cabin and hard cider campaign. Because it was said that Harrison was more comfortable living in a log cabin and drinking hard cider than anything else, and they portrayed Martin Van Buren as a man who lived in the palace, the White House, and ate off gold spoons. So they're really playing this class conflict thing up here. And they actually had a campaign slogan, the Whigs did, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So The main issue, though, really was the American system and the economic depression. But this is really the first modern campaign because of the use of slogans, imagery, that kind of thing. And the Whigs are going to sweep the victory. They'll take the executive branch and the Congress. But unfortunately for the Whigs, William Henry Harrison, who was the oldest man ever elected president at that point, will give the longest inaugural address in the history of the United States. In the cold and the rain, he will catch pneumonia and he will die 1 month after taking office. So the dreams of the Whigs to have the executive office and the Congress come crashing down with the death of William Henry Harrison in April of 1841. And there's the 1840 election. You can see it's still very close in the popular vote, but smashing victory for Harrison in the Electoral College. Okay, well, we'll pick up with this in the next presentation, part 2, and look at what happens next.